Hello, my name is Bourne. I'm the Chief Technical Officer for GPE. Apologies for the slight late start of this session. I think we've been having some technical difficulties. But I'd like to start by thanking everyone for joining and also thanking Dubai Cares and Insights for Education for putting this session together on the first day of RewirEdX. The session will focus on the ongoing COVID crisis and how this creates opportunities and emerging lessons on the importance of evidence in decision-making, particularly around opening and closing schools, to ensure that all children can continue learning and get back to school as soon as possible. But first of all, for those of you who don't know GPE, GPE is a fund and a partnership dedicated entirely to helping children in lower income countries get quality education. And from the early onset of the pandemic, GPE responded rapidly by mobilizing more than $500 million to help partner COVID-19, allocating grants to 66 countries to support learning for the most marginalized girls and boys, equip schools to reopen safely, and strengthen education systems to be more resilient to future shocks. But a critical part of that response was also investing in lesson learning through our grants and in collaboration with others. And this, of course, is ongoing. But one particular exercise I'd like to mention was a workshop with ministries of education of 13 different developing countries to simulate how education systems might react to different degrees of COVID-19 crisis severity, high or low, in the next 3 years. And this work also informed GPE's new strategy. But a key demand I want to highlight from participants was this desire to invest in the capacity building of planning and statistics departments to get more data, better evidence, to help develop their adaptive planning capabilities to use that data so that they could adjust sector plans and adjust their responses to COVID and other crises and learn as we go along. And this is partly what today's session is about. The pandemic led to unprecedented disruptions to education systems and required all stakeholders to adapt quickly and respond to keep children safe and learning. It also created opportunities and emerging lessons on the importance of evidence in decision-making. This discussion convenes a range of different voices. So I'm delighted to introduce a panel with representatives from the Ministry of Education, who is a key partner to GPE. That's the ministry from, that's Dr. Elyas Abdi, the Director General for Basic Education at Kenya's Ministry of Education. I've also got Haldis Holst, the Deputy General Secretary of Education International. Tariq, who is the founder and CEO of the Rumie initiative. And Randa Grob-Zakhary, who is the founder and CEO of Insights for Education and also on GPE's board of directors. So I'm going to start now by turning, if I can, first to you, Tariq. You found a particular way to utilize your private sector background and EdTech to remove barriers to learning for underserved communities, particularly those who live offline. Your company has gained traction during the Ebola crisis in West Africa and has also been essential in enabling lessons within the refugee communities and other marginalized communities. So speaking of data and evidence, your technology captures data that is then used to enhance personalized experiences for each student. How specifically does this continuing capturing and utilization of data lead to improved outcomes?
Thank you, Joe, and thanks everyone for joining us from wherever you are. I'm here in Toronto, Canada, probably in colder weather than most of you right now, but great to join. And thanks for the question, Joe. How I would answer it is to say that when we came to the education space, I had, as you mentioned, a private sector background and spent a lot of time around technology. Had to learn education sort of as a bit of a newer area and how to apply technology to it. And I'd say a few things that I think are interesting coming from the outside and then looking on the inside. The first was evidence is critically important, obviously, in decision making. You tend not to find too many people who disagree with that statement. That being said, the evidence is also a loaded question because evidence means different things to different people. And one thing I found fascinating is that in the technology space, what is thought of as evidence is often not the same as what is thought of in the education space. In the education space, it's thought of as often being sort of large data sets that can be used for academic studies and things that often are very rigorous, but they take many years. In the technology space, by contrast, people think less about evidence and they think more about data, as you mentioned. And the use of that data is less around sort of producing a great data set to publish a paper and advance some sort of idea in an incremental fashion. It's usually used in real time to understand exactly what users are doing and adapt based on that, and usually used to adapt to get greater engagement as above. I mean, in some level, it's also evidence of impact, and so there are quizzes and other things you get data back on and can quickly adapt from, but it's very often around engagement. And you know, what we've found is that I'd say maybe I wouldn't I want to kick this panel off with a controversial point, but I do think evidence is a very much of a loaded word. I really do. I think that the first thing I'll finish with two quick points. One is that when I first started, I kept having conversations with people and they'd say, you need evidence. They'd say, hey, we love innovation. Please come, you have this technology solution. We think it can grow. Then they would say, do you have a 10-year impact study attached? And I always thought, well, that's a little bit unusual. How many innovations come with like proven impact attached? Usually if they have proven impact attached, they're no longer innovative. And so I found that number one, the interest in evidence was being applied as a blunt instrument everywhere, even in areas where we knew we needed innovation and new approaches. And I think that's a bit problematic because by definition, the first example of any kind of innovation or experiment tends not to have much evidence attached by definition. I'd say the second thing is that the concept of what evidence is, as I mentioned, really needs to adapt based on how technology looks at data. And and here's a bit of a sad remark, I suppose, but provocative one also, is that probably 5 years ago, I remember taking part in conferences where people debated, evidence and evidence in education technology. And it seemed that there was this search for a perfect grail. And I think 5 years later, all I've seen is that there are billions of smartphones all over developing countries, and Facebook is on all of them. And I'm not sure how many of them are being used for great educational purposes. And so on some level, I think that technology is an extraordinary opportunity and a promise, but it does mean that some of the existing models that were applied in a non-digital world, the speed at which they move, how data is collected, probably have to change and adapt to a slightly faster moving technology-based world.
Great. So yes, a little controversial in the education world, but I think absolutely critical. And it's something I've also been kind of grappling with, this whole point about how can we, even within our work as GPE, how can we really use data to learn and to adapt and to do it swiftly, but more importantly, also to help our countries who are leading the national education responses be more agile with the use of data. So I'm wondering if you can just give a couple of examples or ideas from your approach that could, that you could see could be taken to scale or used by teachers or national systems in order to be able to really quite quickly help children, individual children improve their learning. What's the sort of scale up at a national system? What are the big lessons we could learn from you?
I think that one of the biggest ones, and this is going to sound like a general comment, but it's actually important, is understanding the importance of engagement when using technology. And so what I mean by that is a lot of the history of education has been thought of very much in the sense of formal classrooms. So formal classrooms, K-12 schooling, and one of the characteristics of those is that you tend to have captive audiences. And so as a result, the focus on the provision of the learning is almost all about quality. Because if you have a captive audience, for example, there's a 1 hour lecture and 7 minutes into the lecture, students get a bit bored. They usually are stuck and they stay in the lecture because, you can't just walk out in the middle of it. There's parental expectations, social expectations, and so on. And so the focus has been heavily on quality. Because you have a captive audience, you can get a very good quality product and bring it down. The one thing that I've noticed that a lot of the space is not fully absorbed as the shift has happened to technology, and for many this year it's become forced and much more rushed than was expected, was the importance of not just quality but engagement. So I'll give you an example. If you're 7 minutes into a video on your phone and you find that video boring and you're a young person and you're using it outside the classroom, you'll just put that phone down, or you'll just click TikTok because it's, the TikTok videos are far more interesting. And so the equation is actually less around quality equals impact. It's actually more quality times engagement equals impact. And it's really the difference of a world where you go into a place where you're captive, the teacher probably tells you to put your phone away, and then you're forced to absorb whatever's there, in which case it's very captive, and it's an audience where equality alone can do it, to an audience where you're trying to get to someone on their phone, and you're competing with a set of products and apps that have been built to compete directly with you, and to be very, very engaging. And I think the challenge there is that, I'll finish with this point, education technology can mean a lot of things to people. The worst example I've seen, to be honest, is systems where they just took a textbook, they digitized it into a PDF, and then they said, now you can have this on your phone. Technically, it counts as education technology. In reality, I think if you have 1,000 young people and they could read a textbook PDF on their smartphone or watch a TikTok video, I'm afraid that, again, the social media tends to win. And I think that, in between a PDF textbook and, what they want to do, there's a lot of room to build models that are both deliver quality and learning, but then also are engaging. And so one of the things that we've done as an example is we've moved towards micro-learning. And it's both because if you learn in 5-minute, 6-minute snippets, recent data shows that you have an improvement of over 20% in learner retention. But the other piece around it is not just improvement in learner retention for the period of time you're using it, it's that you get more people use it even more. And the way to think about that is that the average social media session is 6.5 minutes on Instagram on your phone, but that adds up to 2.5 hours per day. In North America and emerging markets, sometimes even more. In the Philippines, is nearly 4 hours. So the idea is that there's a lot of time, but you have to sort of be able to access it in the way people want to use technology. It's mobile first, it's short snippets of time that align to when they have a few minutes. And I think that those parts are the pieces that are difficult, but the more they can be mastered, the more that it's easy to build a technology solution that is as engaging as the competition, and that becomes supplemental and usable in many different scenarios, even when, of course, people are remote.
Thank you very much, and I could discuss this. I'd really love to talking to you about this a bit more, but hopefully nobody has paused us or turned us off yet, because I'm now going to turn, please, to Haldis from Education International. Haldis, parents have been highlighted as a critical constituency by the conference organisers. School closures have brought parents even closer to the teaching and learning process. And in many contexts, this has dramatically increased the interaction between parents and teachers, and also likely required teachers to provide additional support to parents to ensure continuity of learning. So I'm just wondering how, you with all your many members in Education International, how your member organisations are grappling with this change in role for the teacher, and how this additional insight around home and increased engagement between parents and teachers is being utilised or informing national COVID-19 response strategies.
Well, thank you very much, Jill. That was, it's a very broad and very big question, and not just one answer. But first, hello to you all from another cold place, from Oslo, Norway. I was very taken because I'm a teacher, from what Tariq said of the challenge we have in a classroom in normal times of, capturing our students' attention so that we sort of keep within their attention span, and how much more difficult this has been in a time where the students are moved out of the classroom. And that, of course, is one of the additional challenges that's moved on to parents, that they are the ones that are motivating their children to stay concentrated, to stay tuned, whether it's online or through a book or listening to a radio or whatever it is. But first of all, I would like to state that, of course, parents are the most important people or guardians for teachers. And I would also challenge the word evidence here, because we're coming very close to privacy issues. But for a teacher in their everyday life, I would say the information that parents or guardians supply is crucial for a teacher to be able to do their job properly in a classroom towards the students. But of course, some of that information is privacy driven, so that you don't share it, you don't aggregate it, but it still informs your practice. But of course, when the main place where education happens, the formal education, is moved from a common place in the school to the individual home, you could say that for a teacher to conduct distant teaching, they probably need a whole different set of information. And what we noticed very quickly after the lockdown, we did a survey of our member organizations, and all in all, they reached out to 32 million educators out there. The major concern, almost at the top of the list, was they're very concerned about the students that now, for one reason or another, wouldn't be able to follow up on their education. And there's so many reasons why. There are so many faults that can come into play here. It can be social, economic things. It can be that you don't access the device delivering education on. Maybe students with special needs. There may be language barriers. There are loads of reasons for why kids would be falling off. So it was the whole focus on how can we fill the gap, because school, to a great extent, is an equalizer. And to make sure that we can keep supporting homes and children and fill that gap. And I believe that we need parents more than ever in this process, because it's not about labeling homes on those that are able or not able to follow up. It's the knowledge that although parents are experts on their own children, they are also the community around school, and that we have a collective responsibility of trying to make reality out of that education is to be education for all children. So it's a whole equity issue that I feel has really risen to the top of the agenda. And one of the things we've then done at Education International is that we have developed a framework tool and guide for how you can conduct what we call an equity audit on the ground in a country, because it's contextualized. You can collect aggregated data, but you have to make your decisions and solutions that are relevant on the ground, in the culture, in the country, in the local community. And in this equity audit, we think it's extremely important that also addresses parents and homes. And we have framework questions like which families had access to before and after care programs for childcare needs, because parents can support their children if they actually don't have the time or opportunity to do that. Were measures introduced to identify households that qualified for additional support as a result of the pandemic, the social and economic impact of it? Which students did not have sufficient parental support for distance education and learning during lockdowns, and why? There is a very minority of children out there which it isn't good for being with their parents. It's a small minority, but we know that for some, school is a safe place and home is not a safe place. With which parents were educational establishments unable to establish and maintain contact during lockdowns or reopening, and why? You have to redo your way of communication with parents and home. Some had routines for doing this online, by telephone. Some had only face-to-face and needed to redo the whole structure of it. Was any support provided to parents, families on use of devices for distance education? It may be radios, it may be laptops. You have families with one computer and that don't have stable Wi-Fi, but you still may have education authorities providing online education. So it's about how can we build that gap so that parents, guardians, and school together can move forward to try to build the gap and make sure that education can move forward. And the last point, we do have old evidence from, before the pandemic. And I'm thinking about the main source of contact between school and home, which was the whole concept of homework or homework assignments. And there's a lot of research out there on what kind of assignments work as homework and which don't work, to create a bridge between what's going on at school and what's going on at home. How can homework be the sort of the tie where children can communicate with their parents about what they are doing at work, at school? And how can homework be designed so that all parents can be a positive support in their children's lives, and not thus those that happen to have the knowledge to be able to support their students in what's going on? So I think there's possibility here with new evidence, but also with old evidence. But at the core, parents are extremely important.
Thank you so much for bringing those insights to the conversation. And I think there are going to be many people listening who are teachers like you and myself, parents, and who are really having to see this for themselves through their own experiences in the last 9 months or so. So, I mean, we can talk about this evidence helping us rethink and reshape the relationship between home and school, the importance of being able to do this on a case-by-case basis in some instances, so no one falls through the net. But you've also highlighted, of course, this equity gap that was such a risk of exacerbating. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to move to the next speaker, but that was really helpful. Thank you. I wonder, DG Elyas from Kenya, I wonder if we could turn to you next. And I'm hoping we've managed to sort out the technological problems. Because I'd like to invite you to talk a little bit about Kenya's experience on how evidence played a role in the decisions that you've had to make around school closing and reopening. It'd be useful to hear a bit about the critical decision points, what evidence was available to support you in that moment, and what might have been useful or will be useful for you when you start to think about reopening schools in January. So over to you, and thank you, Haldis.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible. Am I audible?
You're audible and we can see you. That's
Thank
perfect.
you very much.
Nice to see you.
Well, I'm sorry, I've just been on the road, and even as I joined this meeting, I'm in a staff room. I'm joining you from a teacher's staff room in one of our colleges in central Kenya, Muranga Teachers Training College. So I just want to point it out that when the first case was detected here in Kenya in March, on March 13th, I think we were in a panic mode. So we just closed all our institutions from basic to higher education. And I remember at that time, some of the colleges were students were left with one examination paper to go. We're doing some exams here and there, but we decided to close. So because the knowledge about the pandemic was, we did not have enough knowledge. And therefore, when we closed the institution, we, through the leadership of our cabinet secretary, we were able to engage the key stakeholders of the sector together with our Ministry of Health. We assessed the situation, comparing ourselves to other countries globally, in America, Europe, all the continents, Sub-Saharan Africa. We were lucky. We worked very closely with the global education community, specifically Insights for Education, Randa and the team, I'm sure UNESCO. And we were, able to see what other countries were doing. And we had so many options, whether we could open, gradually or open completely. And therefore, equally, the Ministry of Health also was given data on a daily basis within the country on the positivity levels, say, for example, the positivity will also sometimes rise and then come down depending on maybe the measures government puts in place, because our head of state was addressing the country on a monthly basis, and we're coming up with some measures here and there. So at one point, if you must have heard, we said that the academic year was lost, and we were planning to start all over the entire academic year, because for the year 2020, when we closed the school, we only covered the first term, and usually we have 3 terms in the academic calendar. So we were to start in January 2021 to restart the entire 2020 academic year. But later, as a result of the knowledge about the pandemic, the fact that when somebody puts on a mask, when you observe the 1 meter rule, and all this started emerging, we saw that we could transact some business in our education institutions. And therefore, we revisited our earlier, directive by government, and therefore, we embarked on, with the given evidence on what is happening in other countries, the information from Insights for Education, from the medical fraternity, from the knowledge we had then, we decided to now open gradually. And we started with our tertiary institutions and higher education, the universities. What we did was to have a blended kind of learning, where we have the face-to-face and also the online learning for the tertiary institutions and the universities. We did that for some time, and in the universities, actually, we even conducted virtual graduation ceremonies, and the graduating classes successfully finished their work. And when it came to the basic education subsector, what we did was to open with the transition classes, or what we are calling examination classes. And one of the classes, that is grade 4, grade 8, and the Form 4s who are supposed to join the university. So we opened from the 12th of October. They're still on session. We expect the schools now to close on the 12th. And what we are learning, the lesson learned out of that is that our learners are much safer in the schools than outside there. Because we found out that when the schools were closed for all these months, by the time we are starting with, by the time we are gradually open, we were already closed for 6 months. And the reports we were getting within the country was a bit disturbing, because there were cases of, rampant cases of early marriages, early pregnancy. We have had cases of child abuse, child labor, and so on. So what we have decided at the moment, together with the key stakeholders, luckily in this country, because we were closely consulting with our stakeholders, we have not had different voices on the opening dates, because we were taking decisions based on work with the Ministry of Health, based on decisions that were available globally, and therefore we took the decision of now opening fully on January 4th, and all our institutions will resume right from basic up to university education next year, in January, we also embarked on, trying to condense all the evidence we have in form of a guideline for education institutions. All our education institutions, we supplied them with a guideline that was, done consultatively together with all the key stakeholders. The Ministry of Health seconded a few doctors to the Ministry of Health, to the education, and we came up with this guideline that has all the evidence. And we had taken the task of even reassessing our education institutions to ensure that they are compliant with all the measures that are supposed to be put in place, that whether we have the running water, facilities to take temperature, isolation rooms, all that is required. And institutions now, each institution for it to open has to be given a compliance letter to show that they have complied with the requirements, and based on, of course, the evidence and the information that we have been given. So as for the positivity rate in our schools and the fatalities, they're actually very low, and I would say negligible, because our grade 4, 1.3 million students, the grade standard 8, we have around 1 million. Secondary school Form 4s are over 700,000, and the figures, which we were not able to, unfortunately, give the figures here because I'm not authorized to say at the moment. But what I was trying to say is that they are negligible, and that has given us the confidence now to fully open the schools in January for all the grades. So that is what I want to say at this point. Thank you.
Elyas, thank you so much. I'm going to very quickly turn to Randa as our last speaker, because we've only got about 3 minutes left now. But you've just given us a fantastic example of how you've used evidence and emerging evidence to continue to really inform your policy decisions. So thank you. If you could go on mute now. And Randa, insights for education, you've got about 2 minutes now, monitors and synthesizes a vast amount of data from countries around the world, and it's done with the end user in mind. And maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the types of questions you've been receiving and who's asking them.
Sure, Joe, thank you. And thanks to the organizers and Dubai Cares and RewirEd for all of this today and all of our discussion and panelists today. Just to be very brief, I think that Dr. Abdi from Kenya showed very concretely what we've been doing and what we've been supporting in an indirect way. The questions that we've been asked have come from countries. We initially did not plan or see a way for ourselves to contribute to this. We're a very new foundation, and we're focused on making evidence more useful and used. And COVID then struck, and we found ourselves being asked by country partners what's happening in countries as they're starting to open schools. That was the first set of questions. Who's opening? How are they doing it? When are they doing it? And what's happening after they start to open? And what you've heard from Dr. Abdi is that the decision making is a journey. It's not that decisions are made once and then not revisited. This whole process has evolved over months, will continue to evolve. And that's why it's really imperative that we continue to track and monitor what happens globally. Because even though the context is different in every country, the problems are similar. The questions are certainly the same. How will I know when it's safe? What do I do to open safely and stay open safely? And once we're open, how do we minimize learning loss? How do we keep teachers safe? How do we maintain transparency and authentically communicate with the community? And more importantly, how do we learn from the decisions we made a few months ago? And you heard all of that played back by Dr. Abdi. And that is what we're aiming to do. And it's been directly requested by country leaders, opening task forces, media, and more recently, even parents and school board trustees. And just to say this isn't done, I think we're all seeing that this is a really important moment where education, more than any other moment in the last decades, is high on the agenda, very high. It's always been critical, but now we have the opportunity to accelerate progress towards SDG 4, knowing that many students will be left behind because of COVID, and accelerating any ounce of progress we can to make sure that everyone is back in school and learning.
Randa, thank you so much. And let me also thank all of the panelists. I am being urged that we need to close the session now. And I actually really had hoped to have another round of quick fire questions for all of you. And it's really hard to sort of sum up the key pieces you've said. But you know, you've all talked obviously about the importance of data and evidence, and that is critical. But what we've really heard is the way in which this data is made available, that is usable, that can inform the key questions that people are asking, that doesn't take years, it doesn't require an impact study, but that it's much more agile in order to really get us all in this space in education where we are learning and we are adapting. We've also talked about new sort of spheres of education outside of the education sphere. So Haldis talked very much about the importance of the relationship between parents and school and how we need to have greater evidence on that. That also needs to inform the conversations that we are having. And Elyas, one of the things you also picked up on that I think was hugely important was the findings that you were getting around student safety. And the well-being of students, and then that can be both their physical well-being and their psychosocial well-being, and how schools play that role in that, and how actually that is a balance and a trade-off in order to be able to keep students safe and learning. So there's an awful lot that we can think about here in this space around the importance of data and evidence and using it differently as we move forward in the education world. It's certainly something we at GPE have been talking and thinking about, and I know I have two of you who are our board of directors, so you know that. But a real push from Ministers of Education to be on side with governments as they go through this process of learning and adapting, led very much by the countries themselves, but hopefully bringing many partners around to help with that innovation and solution finding, particularly some of the things I think Tariq was talking about. How can we bring all of those findings into the national sphere to help governments really overcome this crisis and be in a better place as we move out of it. So with that, I'm going to thank everybody, and I think that is, as they say, a wrap. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks to the participants for taking part. Bye.
Hey, thank you so much. I just want to say thank you on behalf of the bikers. It was an amazing session, and very sorry for the slight delays at the beginning. And I
Listen,
hope
so, yeah, guys, I'm sorry. I was all over the place with the moderating. I hope you'd got the questions in advance because I was getting all these messages coming in saying, do this, do that, the time's changed, and at the same time, trying to keep on track with quite lengthy questions, but you all were fantastic. Seriously, I'd love to